Thank you. I am also a hand talker. Fair warning if I get quiet. I wanted to thank everyone who's been up here today. Everyone has kind of touched on a piece of what comes next. This presentation is designed to give us basically kind of a mile wide, but about a half-inch deep look at trauma. We have stakeholders from all over the community here. And that's really encouraging because it takes stakeholders from every part of the community. But because of that, it's also going to be a lot of language that for some of you, this might be review. And that's okay. There's always time to refresh. There's a lot of stuff in here. There are a couple of links at the end, but I wanted to start with something because this goes back to the mid-'80s when there was a lot of medical model stuff being put into documentation. This is from someone who was doing their graduate work at the time, and they had a meeting with their supervisor. And the grad student had written something to the effect of childhood unremarkable on the developmental note, because so many childhoods are so unremarkable. But that was the thing, it was like an x-ray was unremarkable, it was the same kind of language. And the supervisor paused and said this, childhood, no matter how normal it may appear, is always, always a difficult emotional and psychological struggle. Each of us who has made it to adulthood has had to survive childhood. It's your job to give the client a voice to the experience of that struggle. That's our job. And it is, anyone who's made it here, congratulations, you lived through childhood. Welcome to what comes next. But this is it. We kind of come at this from this angle. It doesn't, regardless of what population you end up working with, trauma is there. And oftentimes when we approach trauma, we're going to be going back to what happened in adolescence. We're going to be going back to childhood. We're going to be going back to times where maybe the individual didn't have the coping skills that were necessary, didn't have other people modeling those skills for them, didn't have the community supports, the access, all of those things are here. So the objectives are straightforward. We're going to be identifying some of the factors impacting the current adolescent mental health crisis, defining and describing adverse childhood experiences, an operational definition of trauma, because that in and of itself is difficult to come by, identifying and describing components and necessities of effective therapeutic alliances and all the additional stakeholders. That's everyone in this room and way beyond into the counties. And we're going to identify at least a few different integrated treatment modalities. This is to address trauma specifically for adolescents. It bases it on practice-based evidence, which is what do I see work, right? I need to know what works based on my lived experiences, what I've seen in rooms with people I work with, but I also need to go based on evidence-based practice. What do the studies show? And if I can't be flexible between those two, I'm going to loosen. So this kind of gets into it. We've talked, and I've heard others talk today, about some really important pieces here. The Surgeon General's advisory, the different graphs that we've seen put up, the different news stories that have come up. There is a lot going on. And sadly, none of it is very new. It's appearing in different iterations. Some things are far more acute now, and obviously there are very clear new stressors in play. But the underpinnings, the things that went on, this has been on for a while. This is the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey. They ran one from 2009 to 2019. They keep trends over 10-year tracks. And they found some really, really interesting things. Students who felt persistently sad, hopeless, considered attempting suicide, made a suicide plan, or attempted suicide, they rose dramatically. I don't mean just kind of, I mean a lot. Feelings of sadness and hopelessness went up over 10%. And that's persistent. Considered attempting suicide, that was up 5%. 0.5% is a big deal. 5% made a suicide plan, up 4.8%. This is over the span of a decade. And those who attempted suicide up 2.6%. All of this data came in before COVID. All of it. So in October of 2020, there was a lot going on. I don't know if you were there. I don't remember much of it. I'm pretty sure that I'm still in April of 2020 right now. But in 2020, the American Academy of Pediatrics, along with a host of others, came up with an emergency statement. They were like, look, this is a national emergency in child and adolescent health. Not even 14 months later, the U.S. Surgeon General released the advisory protecting youth mental health. This is one of the attachments to this part of the conference. You can also find it online. Like everyone else, I cannot encourage you enough to read it. It is accessible and it is action-oriented. There are a lot of solutions in there. It's not just words. When this advisory came out, it kind of identified two different places. One is, what are all the new factors? COVID, polarized senses of climate, climate itself, right? All of these different things kind of coming into play, but also a lot of entrenched factors that are there. What are the entrenched things, the things that we look at them, but they kind of become part of the landscape? It's like, yes, I know the Catalinas, I see them every day when I go on my way to work. I don't give them the attention they're due because they're so familiar. But familiarity doesn't mean that it's not impactful. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's not worth addressing. So this has recommendations for individuals and institutions. We know that there are two basic parts to look at when we're looking at adolescent behavioral health factors. There's biological, which I'm not going to get into here because I am not a doctor. Right? The biological factors we can break down to a couple of basic ones, right? Neurochemical imbalances. Dr. Arredondo is phenomenal at being able to talk about this stuff. Not my area. However, environmental, that's something we can talk about. And there is a part where environmental and biological kind of overlap. Certain environmental stressors might start up some epigenetics. Genetic expressions that are turned off unless conditions X, Y, and Z are met. If that happens, then they may turn on. So we're going to be discussing a lot about the environmental portion of this. One of the things is the now famous study, the adverse childhood experience. This was remarkable. In the 1970s, one doctor who was working in cardiology noticed a number of people with heart problems had a history of trauma. On the other coast, there was someone else who was running a weight clinic and noticed a lot of folks who were having difficulty there had a history of trauma. Separate coasts, unaffiliated, came together, and Kaiser Permanente created one of the biggest studies in the history of this country to figure out what is the impact of adverse childhood experiences. So this is any traumatic, potentially traumatic event occurring before the age of 18, including abuse, neglect, violence, anything that can impact a child's perception of safety, structure, attachment, stability. We need those things. They're important. If you go down to the Kena Superior Courthouse nearby, you'll see those parenting plans where they do all of the custody stuff and everything else. And the parenting plans say something pretty straightforward. It's like all children need two things. They need love and they need structure. And I'm paraphrasing, but underneath it says something pretty remarkable. It's like, if you have to choose structure. Remember when you were a kid? How many things did you have a lot of decisional power over? I'm going to bed at, oh, I'm going to bed at 8. I have decided not to, I will be going to school. I don't think that I want to get grounded, so yes, I will be tested. Right? We do not have a lot of control over our environment, but the environment does have a lot of shaping prowess over us. Knowing what comes next makes life predictable, makes life safe to explore. So these are big deals. If our idea of structure and safety or stability get hijacked along the way, that's problematic. ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, substance use problems in adulthood. It can, but does not necessarily impact education, job opportunities, earning potentials. And I say not necessarily because ACEs can be prevented. And there are protective factors that go along with this. The other big piece to consider in here is social determinants of health. Social determinants of health are so big. And this is from the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. And I like this definition, just the conditions in the environments where people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life outcomes and risks. That's a pretty big statement. So everything interacts with everything else. And all of those things interact with all of your everything else and will impact all the things that come after, and probably some of the things that came before. Everything just interacts, right? If we break that down, that's what a lot of what this comes down to. So this is how we can kind of track it, and this is important. How do these things interact? I know that the school in my area is funded by property taxes. But I don't, my neighborhood's kind of, you know, it's where I live. Nobody really makes a lot. So the school's pretty underfunded. And because not a lot of people live there anymore, some of what we had, like the grocery store closed a few years ago. They boarded up the strip mall where there had been an urgent care. Right? So now I don't have access to healthcare, quality, neighborhood and built environment is impacted. That impacts educational opportunities. That impacts economic stability. If you have your choice of neighborhoods that you want to live in, what do you need to make that happen? All of these things interact. And just out of curiosity, by show of hands, how connected do you think all this is? I mean, do you think that there's a lot of social and community context, like everyone just agrees, like, hey, we totally want it to be like this? Do you think some people might be upset? Nobody, just me? Okay. That's it. Because all of these things interact. And it goes both ways. This is reciprocal. If the education quality is there, if there are more accesses to care, if there is a greater sense of community cohesion, if there are people saying, look, I have a number of strong social values that coincide with the people geographically around me, that's amazing. Everyone wins from that. It all interacts. Wonderful. Good. So let's take a look at trauma over time. Traditionally, we're used to hearing about this in war, right? Shell shock, war neurosis, broken soldier's heart. This actually goes back way further. The first one that I could find when I was looking through was on Herodotus. That's 440 BCE. Talking about someone who had been in war, came back, had nightmares, lots of flashbacks, avoidant behaviors, lost relationships. Over 2,000 years ago. And we're treating this like this is new. Well, for a long time, we treated it like it was war. I guess in a sense you could make that argument. But what we found was that over time, the concept of trauma grew to envelop survivors of abuse, natural disasters, like Jen pointed out, neglect. Trauma was not unique to a soldier. Trauma was not unique to war. So as all of this came out, we started noticing that, well, trauma is actually not just a question of something physical, like, wow, I made it through a tornado or a car accident. It's I made it out of a really abusive relationship, or financial exploitation, or psychological abuse, or injury, or emotional exploitation, or hurt. All of these things, systemic violence and abuse among them, right? Let's not forget that structures have impacts too here. Whether or not the structure benefits you or actively works against you, that also has the potential to create trauma. However, there's not a lot in the way of like a universal definition, like what is trauma? One of the ones that I like the most actually comes from SANS. They have this conceptual framework and operational definition of trauma that I like. Individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Now this is really vague, right? That's a lot of words in the buffet. But it has to be, because look at what all it has to encompass. It might be psychological, it might be physical, it might be emotional, it might have lasting impact, it might not. Let's say that I'm in a car with several of you and we're on our way back from this today. There's a car accident. Each one of us in the same vehicle end up with the same injuries, get taken to the same place of care, are treated the exact same way, we get released, we all go back. But 2 weeks later, the other 3 folks in the car are fine and I'm having flashbacks. So a traumatic event is a potentially traumatic event. Not everyone responded to it the same. Well, what happened? What was unique about me that I was the one a couple of weeks later experiencing those things? That's where things like adverse childhood experiences, social determinants of health, risk, and protective factors play a lot into the equation. And we can't quantify it. All of this is still being studied. All of this is so new in many respects that it's hard to get something that's a little bit more, say, I don't know, concrete than this. But it requires a flexible understanding because it is a dynamic thing. So there are some protective factors, right? In an environmental sense, it might be individual, it might be family, it might be community. Traumatic events do not universally lead to trauma. Protective, genetic, epigenetic factors, they can play mediating roles. Now, it's not guaranteed because it's mediating. It's not simple cause and effect. But we can make some basic assumptions here, especially when it comes to adolescence, is that, okay, on a family and individual level, if I'm an adolescent and I've experienced something traumatic, some of these things work to my benefit. If I have a stable, safe, nurturing family environment, that is big. Jen pointed out earlier, like social supports, that's huge. You have to activate that. It's one of the fundamental pieces of self-care. It's one of the first things we tell folks to do. If you've been in experience this traumatic, activate your social supports. Also keep moving, right? Structure and social supports. But there's more than that. There's positive peer social supports, families with steady employment, higher education, basic needs that they're provided for, folks who work through problems peacefully. See, kids might not have the words for it all the time, but they know what's happening. Come on. They're modeling what they see. Adolescence is like a giant behavioral health closet. You are just trying on behaviors and you're seeing if they fit. And you're like, I didn't get the thing I wanted, I'm gonna try this on. This is where I yell and yes, I'm going to stick with yelling until that doesn't work. When yelling doesn't work, now I'm gonna start crying. Let's see how that goes. Right? We will try and model each one of these things based on the behavior that works for us. And we will keep doing this until it is no longer useful. And even then, it may take someone going, well, this is a little more than not useful. You didn't go to school for the last 2 months. DCS can get involved. All these other things. So, well, okay, now maybe I'm ready to talk. It has to be more than just kind of dysfunctional. It has to be, I can't do this anymore. What I'm doing needs to change. So again, these factors go both ways. If we're watching things as children, as adolescents, and we see the people who are essentially demigods, when you are an infant, who provide food, shelter, they have money, they have freedoms we don't, and you see the way that they resolve problems, there's a lot of yelling. Or something else. That's kind of how you think things work. See, when I was in second grade, I didn't think anybody could see the front of the room from the back of the room. It was really far away. Then the eye doc came, and we all got our eyes checked. And then I got glasses. And I thought, oh my God, like the whole car ride home looking at car lines and telephone wires, leaves on trees. I didn't know you could see that stuff. What? See, the assumption is the world operates the way that we see the world until we get another reference point. I assumed no one else could see this because I couldn't. I assumed that people behave the way around each other that either me because that's what I experienced. So if I see people modeling particular behaviors, or I don't see particular supports when people are hurting, I don't expect them. Because that's just how the world is. So yeah, everyone in this room supports. In the community, you can find things like access to medical, behavioral care, safe and stable housing, childcare, aftercare, preferably affordable, hopefully free, extended hours beyond 9 hours. I know I'm getting wistful. Engaging after-school programs, strong interdependent partnerships between communities, business, healthcare, and education. What did we see earlier today from TUSD? That exact thing, a strong partnership between school and healthcare. And it was interdependent. We saw a need, we heard from the individual student. And that letter was moving and difficult to hear. And rather than do nothing, TUSD engaged other community partners to come up with this amazing app. That's incredible. That's the power of protective factors within the community. That is where social determinants of health can take us if we work together, right? So all of this becomes very, very important. Community involvement, feelings of connectedness between citizens where violence is neither tolerated nor accepted. These things help. But again, this is a two-way street, right? Finding the stakeholders, this is important, right? Any community is just, Merriam-Webster says it's a unified body of individuals. This is a community in here right now, by that definition. And we represent some sort of microcosm of a larger community out there, which is a microcosm of a larger statewide community, of a larger national community, of a larger regional community, of a larger global community. But finding stakeholders, this is something that the Surgeon General's advisory is really, really clear on. Identifying key stakeholders is pretty much just making a grocery list of what your community looks like. Look at that. Adolescents, families, educators, school staff, districts, health professionals, organizations, media, entertainment, journalistic organizations, technology companies, gaming, and social media. Community organizations, funders, foundations, employers, federal, state, local, tribal governments, as well as actions each stakeholder can do to nurture these protective factors. This is a really important point here. One of the arguments that I hear a lot is this idea that when we are talking about trauma, and especially when we start to work with adolescents and they're coming into the stage of in-group, out-group, what do I look like in relationship to my peers? I want to be my own person. I'm looking for greater independence. Is that there is this very kind of rugged American individualism that we see and show up in a lot of places. But here's the thing. Paradoxically, the idea of rugged American individualism requires interdependence within every one of those levels. If my healthcare and my education and my community don't get along, and my family and I do not reap the benefits of that, if there are not federal, state, local, municipal, tribal policies that back us, how am I supposed to even approach the idea of independence, much less really get into rugged American individualism? No, it's predicated on interdependence. It doesn't work without it. And each one of these is its own ecology. And to that end, it's worth noting how one simple change to an ecology can make for a really big difference. A number of years ago, there were no wolves in Yellowstone National Park. They've been slaughtered. And the deer population has just grown rampant. And at some point, National Park Service, in conjunction with some conservationists, said we need to get these wolves back. We're going to introduce wolves into Yellowstone. So they did. Now, until this point, all of the deer had absolutely no primary predator in the area. They had spent decades without it. So they would go right up to the edge of the river and just drink their rice content. And they would change what was growing along the riverbank. The wolves came back. Imagine, you're a new resident to the area. come down to the local watering hole, and there's this all you can eat buffet. It's all here. It's what happens. So the deer scatter. It's no longer safe to be there. As a result of reintroducing something that belonged in that ecology, it did a number of things. The deer population returned to normal levels. Fewer deer stopped. The ones that survived were incredibly healthy. There was less illness. The wolf population thrived. But interestingly, it didn't stop there. You see, the deer had been changing the way the river flowed because they had been eating all the things along the river's edge. So by adding in these mammals that normally go after these mammals, you ended up changing not just the food chain, but the way this entire river flowed. It actually changed the course of the river in a very short span of time. Altering one factor has ripple effects that goes across the whole of the ecology. This kind of interdependence isn't just optional, it is absolutely integral if we want to be able to work with adolescents who are working with trauma. So this is where things get a little more therapy. Not everyone here is going to be creating like the same kind of therapeutic alliance, but a therapeutic alliance is really, really necessary. It doesn't matter if you are just someone that the child trusts, if you are their school counselor, private counselor, an agency counselor, or just someone that they know. These basic rules apply across the board. And it's pretty straightforward. Carl Rogers came up with this in 51. He was like, these are core conditions. He said, this is enough. These things are not just necessary, but they are sufficient for change. If you can just do these few things, people will change. That was the argument. Now there's a lot of debate about that now. Some people say yes, and some people say no. That's why we have different theories. But some of these things, person-centered therapy, of these 6 conditions that he posits originally, 3 of them are still with us. And they have been wrapped into pretty much every therapy model since. The core conditions of counseling. And the core conditions of counseling have not changed very much in the last 70 years. This is still highly relevant stuff. So what are they? You know, modern, postmodern theories, they build on this. They've got more to say about it. But they still notice that, you know, they are still pretty necessary if you want to get in. Establishing a rapport. You have to. If you do not get along with the person that's trying to talk to you, you think they can come back and talk to you again? I'm here to help. Tell me, right? And you're just like, it's like, who is this monotone woman? I'd really like to know. I didn't mean to do that. Right, you're not gonna come back. You cannot help someone who does not come back into your office. You can't. I don't have the peer-reviewed study for that, but I'm pretty sure that's just how geography and proximity works. If they are not in your office, you can't help them. So they have to come back. Building rapport is absolutely essential. The core conditions of counseling provide a big piece of that. One of the first things that I will tell every single person that's ever come to see me is at the end of the session, like we've asked a lot of questions, here are the forms, we've done the things, we completed the things, great. But the last question I'm going to ask you is probably the most important question I can ask you today. Is, are you a danger to yourself or others? Which is, how did this feel? So I'm going to defer to the folks that I work with a lot during the course of this, but this is the first and most important time that I'm going to do that. Because if they don't feel like this is a good fit, guess what? There are other therapists. I'm not concerned about my feelings here. If someone is coming to you to talk about, say, trauma, we're trying to establish an alliance, we're reaching out for help, your concern has to be first and always for their care, for the coordination, the continuation, and the quality of that care. If the first thing that comes in your mind is, oh, they didn't like me, you are not helping. It's a natural thing to think. It's a natural thing to feel like, oh, that stinks, they didn't like me. But if you can kind of say, well, they didn't like me, and I then went to advocate all over the place to find them the best possible fit, because my feelings don't get to come first here. That's why I have my own therapist. My feelings per se. Their feelings get to come first, right? They're the ones seeking treatment. So building that is absolutely essential. So what are these things that we're talking about? We got 3. Congruence, unconditional positive regard, empathy. For adolescents especially, feeling safe is important. What are the things that we find out with ACEs? Things that interrupt stability, safety, structure. Well, that's problematic. If you have someone who's coming to you who doesn't have a lot of safety or structure or stability, it would probably be useful if you could model those things. If you were congruent in that moment, meaning your outside self matches your inside self, your professional and personal selves are well aligned, meaning you engage in Gen Pow's now trademarked version of self-care. Right? That's just it. That's a big part of what Jen was talking about, this idea of congruence. Like, what does it mean when we're acting in accordance with our values? It needs us to engage with our values. Value conflicts are uncomfortable. So to engage with our self-care is absolutely imperative. Engaging with our community partners, say in areas of schooling, healthcare, policing, also imperative. So we can form those really important community partnerships. But again, it's got to come back to, does that make sense? Within the confines of this relationship, a congruent, genuine, integrated person. This means within the relationship, this person is free and deeply themselves. Not faking it. You just get to be you. I was like, I left my house, I went to work, I got to stay myself, I came home, I stayed myself, and did that. Versus if you go to work and you have to put on a mask, that's a lot of extra steps. It starts to slip off in the middle of the day, right? But you're trying to stay congruent. Oh, I swear, I'm very patient. I'm actually hungry. Go take care of that piece of meat, come back. Right? If the mask starts to slip off and you are not, in fact, congruent, that is going to show up, and the person in your room is going to notice that. So Roger says, this is someone who's representing themselves, and they're aware of that representation. They do it well. They're good at it. And it comes naturally because that's just them. Unconditional positive regard. A lot of people get stuck on this. I mean, unconditional positive regard. Some of these people that I talk to, I don't know if I can. We have a lot of things that don't match up. I don't know if I have those same values. You don't need to. You don't need to. It's not about your feelings, right? It's about the continuation, coordination, and quality of their care. So unconditional positive regard just means that we are experiencing a warm acceptance of each aspect of this person's experience as being a part of that client. There's no room for judgment. There's no room for it. You can, it's not going to go real well. You're probably not going to have that person come back to your room, and we know that people who are not in the room tend not to be able to be treated by you. Right? So the last one on here is just empathy. Experiencing an accurate, empathic understanding of clients' awareness of their own experience, right? To sense their private world, and this is important, as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as if quality. I can't step fully into someone else's shoes. We can't. It's as if, right, when we're listening, I have to get close enough that it's as if this is happening. But if we want to stay congruent and view these folks with unconditional positive regard, we have to maintain an amount of distance there. Professional, coordinated, congruent, empathic distance. A whole lot of unconditional positive regard. So those are the big pieces. Now, all of the stuff before, that's just, the preceding definition, right? So what's the practical value of this? So this is a giant meta-analysis from Leiber back in 92. And there have been some since, but this is a real straightforward one. So take a look at this. Therapeutic factors. What is the largest thing on that pie? It looks like, I can't control that at all. 40% extra therapeutic factors. So I get to see someone for like an hour, and then 200 hours pass, and I see them again. Those 200 hours make up 40% of the possibility for change. the single greatest thing involved in the change process is completely beyond our control. Completely. This is where the stakeholders come in, right? This is where that interdependence comes in. The idea of social determinants of health, positive protective factors, right? That's what can come in there. But the single largest factor within any helping relationship is the Therapeutic Alliance at 30%. Interventions, they make up 15%. Expectancy, another 15%. It's not so much the particular intervention as it is the relationship between the two folks in that room. What is the reality you've constructed there? And does it work? Specifically, does it work so that these folks can empower themselves? We don't have any power to give you. What? We facilitate the power you already have. Right? I don't give power. None of us give power. But helping people recognize, understand, nurture, and facilitate their own power, that is impressive. Watching somebody realize that in that moment, that's a cool feeling. So that is the largest part in here. So let's take a look at it. The core experience of psychological trauma are disempowerment and disconnection from others. The recovery, therefore, is based on the empowerment of the survivor and the creation of new connections. Recovery can take place only within the context of relationships. It can't occur in isolation. We need those relationships, right? Back to the ecology, back to what depends on other things. Now, the first principle of recovery is the empowerment of the survivor. She must be the author and arbiter of her own recovery. Others may offer advice, support, assistance, affection, and care that cannot cure. That's kind of hard to hear, right? What do we do every day? That's what all of us would love to do. I would love to be able to walk in and be like, welcome, ping. Next. I would have so much more documentation. But that's just it. We can't. We can do everything but not cure, right? Advice, support, assistance, affection. We can do these things. It doesn't require a therapist, right? All of these are about helping relationships in general. We are all stakeholders. The lens of this piece is about what it looks like through the eyes of a therapist. But some of these things are applicable beyond this wall. And that's the goal. That's why we're going a mile wide, half an inch deep, to keep as many of these things applicable. So, evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence. These are two very different things, but both of them are really, really relevant when we are working with trauma. Now we're finally arriving at it, right? We've talked about risk factors, protective factors, trends. We've talked about the importance of an alliance, what a safe relationship looks like. For some folks that we work with, that may be the first safe relationship they experience. Be gentle. Right? Evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence are keys to interventions. Both of these things are incredibly important when we're working with treatment planning, when we're working with goal setting, when we're trying to collaborate. We don't do this alone, right? They get to help on this. They get a voice for every step. So practice-based evidence is basically, let's start with evidence-based practice. It's basically the integration of the best available research with clinical expertise in the context of patient characteristics, cultures, and preferences. Do you have randomized controlled trials? That's really what that is. Was there a significant value found? What was the p-value? What's the confidence interval, right? Is there evidence? Can it be supported scientifically? That's what this comes down to. Practice-based evidence is the scientist practitioner model, where practice is both the art of translating from that knowledge base, because the word salad above kind of gives you an idea of why so many people think that we can put them to sleep. Right? Sorry, what does it do? Right. But in this is the translation from that knowledge base, the science and the research of the discipline into the specific problems and the issues. So that's part of it. But the other part is applying judgment derived from both the science and the knowledge gained from experience, right? I learned the science, I went in, I applied the science, I found this works better than this, and no longer use the part that doesn't generally work. There's where the experiential part comes in, right? We need both of these to help people in preventing, mitigating problems without, and addressing challenges and opportunities. EVPs are essential to guiding ethical treatment. You can find it in every single treatment plan that's out there. But because individuals happen to be unique, and there is no universal approach, and you cannot treat people that aren't in your office, you have to also include what do you know? What is the experience like? How do these things connect? So this is a very, very short version of what it is, because I know I'm running a little short on time. For adolescent trauma, these are the 4 that we're going to be going over. I am so ashamed of that singular parenthetical that I missed. And I've been looking at it for over a month, and I've been wondering if I could get Desiree to upload it again, but I was like, man, she's really busy. I was like, I'll just wait until I get her an own meshing. Sad for her. Lack of parentheticals. So these are, all of them we'll find, it's like some of these are really, really useful for therapists. Some of them are really, really useful for educators. For example, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, kids narrative exposure therapy, these are really wonderful things that therapists can use. They've got a lot of evidence behind them. Trauma, affect, regulation, guidance for education and therapy. Guess what? It includes education. And the last one, the neurosequential model of therapeutics, that's one that isn't even really just therapy. It's not a series of interventions. It's a way of thinking about how the brain works. And there is a version of that where you can get certified as a teacher, you can get certified as a therapist, you can get certified in the community, right? It's not unique. So it is imperative to employ an individual tailored approach. This is the big one. When utilizing any of these interventions, you can't just open up one of these books and be like, trauma, yes. It's time for CBT, the gold standard, right? It's useful, but if the person is not responding, if the adolescent is entirely shut down, if they are currently nonverbal, do you think that challenging thoughts in that particular moment is going to be the best way to help them move forward? What might they need before that? So each one of these is imperative to use organically, right? I have to do this with an amount of humility. I don't know your life, I'm sorry. They only offered advanced degrees in clinical mental health counseling. I couldn't get one in Vanessa. It wasn't offered at my university, right? There was no graduate level like, oh, I want a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling of Vanessa. I couldn't, right? They didn't give it for individual people. I'm sorry. So we get a general model, which means that every single person we see is the expert of their life, and we get to walk alongside them. And how cool is that? But we're going to have to defer to them as a result on a regular basis. And unless you approach from that stance of not knowing, you're not giving them a lot of room to tell that story to begin with. So we have to use things like cultural humility. If you can't see that, wow, my concept of time or family or values are different than yours, and respect that and bracket whatever it is you're feeling, because what is it not about? It's about their care. Quality, coordination, right? Bracket it. We have to use all these things, and it has to be in our scope of competence. So each one of these, just briefly, right? There's a lot of resources for these, and there are 4 pages of references at the end of this that are all APA subjects, like being in grad school. So just briefly, trauma-focused CBT. This is CBT, but it's used for 3 to 17. And it's often utilized in the treatment of PTSD. It includes the use of a supportive caregiver in sessions, whether or not that caregiver is a parent, right? Not everyone has that. You have a caregiver. What does that look like? Normally, this is comprised of 8 modules. Now, every one of these things has a dozen, if not more, pieces on it. This uses practice, psychoeducation and parenting skills, relaxation, affective modulation skills, cognitive coping skills, the trauma narrative and cognitive processing, in vivo exposure, right? We're trying to get you habituated to this so you don't have that same response. Conjoint adolescent and parent sessions, kids can't do it alone. right? All of us are stakeholders. Get the parents involved. And then enhancing safety and future development. KidNet basically focuses on ages 6 to 17. It attempts to co-construct in a room this whole thing. You can use all kinds of stuff. Graphic timelines, scale of 1 to 10. What are the best moments? What are the worst moments? Give me a 5-minute narrative about it. We'll write it down together, then we'll process, right? The second half, we'll process. Each one of these, we're trying to create a coherent narrative resulting in, oh, look, also client habituation, symptom reduction, and increased self-regulation. This is the pattern. Trying to take something that is inherently scary because it's traumatic and habituate it into memory, where it is simply something that occurred but no longer creates the same kind of physiological response in body, feeling, or mind. Every one of these goes for the same piece. Target, not the story. I feel like I should have written that up. I'm sorry. That's my bad. According to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, another great resource on Trauma Affect Regulation Guide for Education and Therapy is an evidence-based practice. It focuses on education and therapy in a strengths-based capacity, which is a lot of what we've been talking about today, what Dr. Arredondo said earlier. It's very structured. It teaches 7 skills to address emotional regulation, trauma processing, relational repair, self-efficacy, right? Can I do what I set out to do? This model is often employed in detention settings or with high-risk youth. It may be adapted for family therapy or group formats. That's it, right? These can be used in a lot of different ways. And lastly, NMT, neurosequential method of therapy or education unit. It is not a set of interventions. It's an assessment that helps us figure out what part of the brain got impacted by trauma. Why can't I access my cortical function? Because I'm in the middle of a stress response and my diet supplements and charge right now. I'm so flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, I can't do this. Knowing that is a drastic change. So this helps folks figure that out. How does it work? It doesn't just give the structural assessment, it then gives interventions that involves, you guessed it, stakeholders, all the way across. All the stakeholders to figure out what's going to work best for them. This approach may be adapted through the various models. It includes caregiving, sport, early childhood. Again, all of these things are important, but this is the big conclusion here. Adolescent behavioral health is a current, pressing emergency. It is informed by biological factors. It is informed by environmental factors, adverse childhood experiences, social determinants of health, trauma. They may have lasting impacts on a person's lifespan, and they necessarily require an ecological approach that engages all the stakeholders, because it took failings within that same ecology to generate it in the first place, right? So we need timely access and affordable evidence-based care, and we need more people. Is that part of the reason we're here? For these things to be effective, we need a therapeutic alliance. You have to not just have people that are available, it has to be somebody who's a good fit. Our task, and this is it, our task is to remain congruent, empathetic, with unconditional positive regard, to approach that individual with non-judgment, to stay curious, and to faithfully assist that individual in rediscovering their own power. And that's a lot of references. It's just lots of references. That's what I got. Thanks.
I do not have any questions on the chat right now.
Oh, thank God.
But we do have some time if you guys, if somebody wanted to raise their hand and ask a question, we can do that. Any questions from the audience? Great, I think we're done. There's none in the chat, so thank you so much.
I'm so grateful for this, because I don't know how to even start on all of those. They're all there, and you have links to all of them. I don't think it's
No? I've not been to a CME event where I was just like it kept my whole attention the entire time. We have such great speakers, so let's give another applause for our speakers. And before we all go, I also want to thank the SAHAC folks for really stepping up and helping to put this together. This is one of our first events, so we had to go through the whole learning how to do CME. We had to learn how to do this in a digital platform. Desiree, who you've heard speak earlier today, she's kind of like the mastermind of all this. So thank you so much, Desiree. You did a wonderful job. And you see Jessica sitting next to her. She's been helping behind the scenes as well. And Kristen and Yolanda are back there. Thank you so much, guys. And then we have Stephanie that has been during the entire conference, standing right outside those two doors that have been kind of addressing technical issues and making sure the quality is good. So thank you, Stephanie. And of course, Vanessa Sini she was a critical part of this whole thing, putting together the speakers, the agenda, getting everything in place. So thank you so much, Vanessa.
For his leadership throughout all of it.
Also, somebody else who was actually really critical for SAHAC being at our Rio first. She couldn't be here today, but she's attending virtually. For Nancy Johnson, the CEO of our Rio, who brought SAHAC to our Rio. Thank you. And then last but not least, all the folks that attended the conference. I think we have really reiterated over and over that it really is a community effort to address mental health. I think involving all the stakeholders is super critical. And out of this conference, we're hoping that we just get an increase in medical knowledge on mental health, but that we gave you a tool and experience that you can take with you that will change the way you maybe interpret information, maybe that changes your action that you take with your patients or you take care of people, and that you learn more about resources in the community so that we can all treat mental health in the community together as a community. So thank you very much for being here today. And that, just don't forget about those extra sessions. If you want to have some additional time with one of the speakers, we have those rooms that they're going to go to, right, Desiree? And the folks online, if you haven't added those sessions to your schedule, you can do that now. So thank you very much. Have a great day and great weekend. And I hope to see everyone in the community. Thank you, guys.
No, I didn't find it. I don't know.